Welcome to Horticulture, where a group of extension professionals and plant people talk about the business, production, and joy of planting seeds and helping them grow. Join us as we explore the culture of horticulture. Hi, I'm Alexis, and I'm here to tell you if you're cold, they're cold too. Your plants, that is.
Oh.
If they're cold, bring them in, right? What is that
Bring them
saying?
inside, yeah.
There's like pictures of raccoons and,
and like coyotes. Then people are like, I found this dog outside. And you're like, that's a
I have a
coyote.
random cat in the other room right now that I've locked out, and it's an outdoor cat. It looked cold, so it's in the other room in my basement right now. It's fine.
Oh,
it was cold.
You're nicer than I am. Our poor little kitten Chocolate Chip wants to come in, and I'm just like, oh.
You're an outdoor kitty.
You're an outside one. You get to live in the garage with a cat bed and everything.
Yeah.
So
our barn cat is so fluffy right now. Like, so cute.
Oh, yes. It's fluffy and so cute.
They're so fluffy and cute. But you know what isn't fluffy? And probably not cute, your houseplants if you've left them outside and you're in zone 7 or above.
I've got a lot of
them below, I guess.
And if they are, please tell us what kind of houseplant that is, if it is surviving in this weather and also fluffy.
Yeah. So we've had nights in the teens already in Kentucky, multiple nights in the teens and below freezing, and daytime temperatures around freezing. So hopefully all of your houseplants are in by now. And we've had some episodes on houseplants, but I think one thing that it's timely, I was doing this recently, was what I call your tender perennials that I think a lot of people forget about. So it's like one thing I wanted to talk about was those things that are a little bit extra sensitive. So I'm looking at you, figs. So if you're a fig person, you need to be giving them some extra TLC. Have you
even the hardy figs, Alexis?
Even the name, like with a name like Chicago Hardy, needs a little extra.
What's it? Turkey brown turkey. What am I?
Brown turkey. Yeah, brown
turkey.
Really
brown some years.
Yeah. If you don't provide them a little extra coverage.
We call them tender perennials because usually this is a case scenario where the root system might stay alive and they'll come back up from the root system. A good example is fig, or they are tolerant of the cold, but maybe not tolerant of like wind and drying weather like that. Yeah. So if you're in an area that maybe gets a lot of snow, you might be fine because snow is an insulator. It also keeps moisture into some of those evergreen leaves like rosemary, sometimes sage. And so that's why we call them tender, because it's not necessarily like a oak tree, right? That it can get really, really, really cold, or a pine tree, and they're going to be fine and they're going to live through that. There are some plants that need something a little bit extra. And there's some perennials. So like I have heirloom chrysanthemums, and I dig mine and I pot them up and I bring them in as mother plants, but I don't necessarily bring them in and treat them like a house plant, right? Like I'm not putting them in with light and, a bunch of warmth or whatever. They can stay at 40 degrees, even a little bit lower than 40 degrees, and they kind of go dormant in a way. But I need to keep them sort of above freezing and out of that direct wind pressure. And so I like to bring that up because I feel like that's what people struggle with the most, is those plants that are like, yeah, they're perennial, but
First off, can anyone tell that Alexis is excited about this topic?
Yeah.
She was shot out of a cannon.
She is ready. We did not get a question about food.
No questions.
Yeah, she's just like, hey, what's up?
This is a plant podcast.
Yeah, if they're cold, you're cold. Let's go. So I think something that would be beneficial to me before we proceed in the conversation is, can we just sort of word salad some of the things, the types of plants that you're talking about? So you mentioned fig. Mm-hmm. You mentioned this heirloom chrysanthemum. Is that like any chrysanthemum is in that kind of fits that?
So not necessarily. So you're like your pot mums, right? A lot of people, they go in the fall in September and August and they buy a mum at the store or at a local, grower's place. Those mums are usually not what we consider hardy mums. Or they are hardy, but planting them in the fall is not ideal. They're not able to get established long enough. So if you are going to plant mums, I recommend doing that in the springtime and letting them get some time. But there are ones that are considered hardy. And literally, if you go look them up and go to buy some, they are called hardy mums. And they're going to be the ones that I'd recommend for those of you who get freezing temperatures, and they need still a little bit of mulch on them and they'll come back from a root system. But usually the mums you're going to buy as pots at the store are not really considered to be a hardy variety. So the heirloom ones are right in the middle between those two.
Yeah. And this is a tough conversation for me today because what year was that, you all, that we had just the 20 below zero for like a week, over a week?
Right.
It's a really tough conversation for me today because, people are good observers. They will observe a plant for 3 or 4 or 5 years outside and it does well. And they'll say, oh, that must be hardy. It's going to be a hardy plant. And then you'll have a year here in Kentucky, once again, zone 6 and 7 typically, but sometimes we'll get much harsher and sometimes much milder winters than that. But you'll take something like that hardy mum and all of a sudden it's not hardy anymore. So this conversation is a good one today, but it's also a tough one for me because, we got so many calls during that cold snap, that unusual cold snap where it was 20 below zero. I mean, it killed plants that I consider I'd never seen in my career. Had really significantly killed back plants like boxwoods that I'd always considered super consistent, super hardy. And Alexis, it wiped out those heirloom mums that people had for years next to the foundation of their homes, and they were just huge and magnificent. It wiped a bunch of those out. So this is a tough conversation today sometimes for people to get a handle on, because they'll say all of a sudden, well, what happened to my boxwoods? Why did they die? And they've been fine for 30 years.
Yeah.
Because we're
the
talking
answer
about
is always, it
conditions.
depends.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I was thinking the exact same thing, right?
Yeah.
Because like when Alexis started talking about like sage and rosemary, like when I do an herb class, we'll talk about them and being like some more of those. I always say like it's hit and miss, right? Because like you might have a location that they might thrive in outside, but they're not always going to be happy there. Or if we do get a cold snap, they get completely wiped out. So it might be like a better idea to bring that rosemary in, for the winter, or think about different ways to overwintering it. But then, and lavender's a whole different thing, but just like lavender's a big one where people are like, well, I've planted it and it's always like done well in this one spot, but then
what
you see where
disease did it
people
get?
plant it, and then like by year 3, it's gone, right? Like it just doesn't withstand.
So another way to talk about these things, these types of plants that we're talking about, maybe is plants that are on a tipping point of hardiness within our zone. Like they could be hardy,
That's a great way to
could
put it, Brett.
not be hardy. That's not like some super crazy cold tolerant thing.
I hear the word
nor is it
perennial.
definitely a house plant, and if it gets below 50, it's going to die. It's like in this range where site selection makes a huge difference. Like, for instance, we have elephant ears that some people have. They'll never be able to sustain elephant ears. They have to dig them every year. And then we have them. We put them in 2014. They come back every year. Just happens that they're shielded from the
microclimates. Just
I know people who are trying to kill these big, massive, beautiful cannas.
Lilies,
and they're beautiful, and they're like, we can't get rid of this. And I'm like, other people plant them, and they're like, they dig them up and take care of them, and you're right. It's just like that
and
perfect
this is
spot,
what makes
climate.
This conversation so tough for me. Is it the cultivar variety, which a lot of times, if they've been there a long time, you may or may not know as a homeowner the specific cultivar that it was. Was it just a cold tolerant type? Or is it just a microclimate like you just mentioned, Brett? And it really is tough to kind of get to the root of these matters. No pun intended. I know. I was waiting for that one. But it is tough because some of these things you'll read on canna lily, or and some of these things are like caladiums, and you're like, well, they're not winter hardy, but yet people have been growing them. I know people that have been growing them 25 years and consistent. They come back. So what's the deal?
We have canna lilies in a slightly different spot from our elephant ears, and they come back, and they were getting so dense that we had to dig everything out, divide, and redistribute, and we never dug them out. Because the first year we did them, this 2014, we put them in. A friend of Annie's, her dad was a gardener and brought us some. Didn't tell us, we didn't look it up. They didn't tell us anything. We just didn't know, and they just kept coming back. And then it was only later that I discovered, some people actually dig these like as a matter of course.
Normal course of business.
And I think for us, thinking about like what makes those site selection, or those specific site microclimates, that one is like directly, it's really one of the few directly south facing parts of our property. And where they're planted is not right up against, but basically right up against the foundation of the house. And so you have this warming kind of heat sink effect from the foundation, along with the sun coming in and warming that soil just enough to keep them alive. And in the case of the elephant ears, they're really sheltered from the wind in particular, and so that's part of the soil, and it's also kind of up against the house, and so I think it kind of gets it gets nice shade during the summer, so it's not in the afternoon, so it's not really like having to fight for its life for the hot part of the year. It's able to kind of thrive in that way, but there's other parts of our place where if we put those out there, there's no way they would make it.
I've seen in zone 5, and now there's a named variety of amaryllis, but in zone 5, it overwintered for years. And it's a red one, and I forget the cultivar, but it's a winter hardy amaryllis now, and it's marketed. I don't know if you guys have ever seen those, but it just was so shocking to see that people in Ohio were growing these things, and they consistently come back, and it's a amaryllis, a hypestrium. But it came back year after year, and here I am religiously bringing those things in and out because, my particular, cultivar does not overwinter, but here there is one, and they've kind of marketed this thing now, and it's hardy even into like zone 5, and it's pretty amazing.
For those who sometimes like me struggle with when the zone number goes down, that means colder. So zone 5 is colder than zone 6, which is colder than zone 7. And so you're saying it survived. You're bringing it in a
North
zone 6, zone 7 situation, and it's surviving in an area that's even colder than that. That's pretty cool.
But it's one of those things that I was just blown away. And that was I kind of investigated that, and it was a cultivar thing. It was intentional, and now it's marketed as such that it's pretty consistently code tolerant. But it's pretty amazing to me that some of these plants, there's a big variation within the plants depending on breeding. Some are totally not hardy in one location, whereas a different cultivar within that same grouping of plants is cold hardy. So that does make a big difference too.
Are dahlias an example?
Yeah. So dahlias are typically one that we tell you to dig, and 7 is right on the edge to be safe. If you're a little bit more cautious, if you got some specialty varieties, then dig them and store them away for the winter.
Could you just give the snapshot of what dig means? Because I honestly did not know what that meant until like 3
when they
years
say
ago.
lift, I'm like, what is that?
Yeah, so
lift and separate.
Yeah.
So caladiums, cannas, gladiolus, dahlias, they all make this structure, this underground structure. So it's either a tuber or a corm. So, something similar to potato or something similar to, garlic, or most people know what gladiola or bulbs like tulips, right? So they make this underground structure that they store nutrients in, and it's how they get started the next spring. So when we say dig or lift, we mean we're pulling that structure out of the ground. We're cutting back all the above ground parts. We're pulling that out, and then we're storing it just like you would store sweet potatoes in your cabinet, kind of thing. So something similar to that, is what we're meaning. We're pulling that out of the ground. We're keeping it above freezing, but usually we're still keeping it below about 50. For most,
what's the temperature range, Alexis? 40 to 60 for most plants. Some like it more 60, some like it more 40.
From a storage,
that's a range, isn't it? Like
from
40
a storage
to 60
perspective.
For storage? Yes.
So I think it depends on whether or not you're wanting to keep it from going dormant. So when you're typically when you're lifting and digging something as a corm or a tuber, you're just keeping the underground structure of it, and you're not wanting it to start growing over winter. You just want it to chill. You're going to keep it between like 40 and 50, 38 to 50, basically above freezing, but below a temperature where it's going to actively start growth. But there are other cases like scented geranium or heirloom chrysanthemums, or even regular geraniums. I know a lot of people will pull their regular geraniums out of a pot and bring them inside, put them in something else. So you might want to keep those growing, and you certainly could keep a dahlia growing in your house over winter if you want to. I mean, they're native to Mexico. They grow year round, but I wouldn't recommend it. It just would get really big and really leggy and really unhappy because of the lack of light. So I wouldn't recommend it. But yeah, that's what we mean when we say dig or lift. We mean pulling out of the field
the root structure.
Now,
the next step after. Oh, go ahead, Jessica. Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say, and you're way more of an expert on this, Alexis, the dahlia kind of stuff. But like, they can be left out there and they can survive, but it's not going to be what you think it's going to be when they come back up. Well, if they survive, not getting like too much, but they are not going to look like that same flower that you had the year before.
Well, dahlias are true to type because they're coming back from
like
that
little, or like not
They'll be
as
knocked back in some cases knocked back. Yeah.
It kind of depends. So I think the key to overwintering a structure such as elephant ears or dahlias or something that is maybe technically you should dig, and like if you got a really cold winter, which sometimes happens in Kentucky and various places, every few years we get like a really hard winter. If you're in a place like that where you're right on the verge, I think the key is keeping it dry. So a dry tuber doesn't rot. I think a lot of the time our tubers can handle the cold temperatures because that soil, we know, of course, is a really good insulator, but they can't handle a wet soil, right? So if you can keep them dry, you can keep them insulated from, wind in some way. So maybe you're mulching them or something, which also helps keep the soil more.
What's your favorite mulch, Alexis? I know there's a lot of discussion on this with different groups. Number one, it's whatever you have handy, but what's what's some of your favorite types of mulch? That is a critical point.
Yeah. My soils personally, I know, are high in phosphorus. So I like a leaf mulch because it's something that breaks down in the summer, but it like is mulchy enough during the spring to keep down the weeds, and then it kind of breaks down and is more nutrient accessible later than like a wood mulch might be. But wood, I've used the tree company drops it off. I have a giant mound of tree mulch now.
That's a good resource.
So
That's an amazing
excited.
Resource.
I just like relish every time I see it. I'm like, oh, I'm the queen of mulch.
That mulch is so important. Like it evens out the temperature fluctuations and the moisture. So good stuff.
But I really like, I tarp my dahlias. So I use a big silage tarp. And if you're not familiar with that, it's just a tarp that's not woven. So it's not like a blue tarp you would buy at the store where that's like that woven plastic. It's just straight plastic. So it's not permeable, which is important because the biggest reason is I want to keep it dry. It's also black on one side. It's white on the other. So I keep the black side up to help get some of that solar gain into the soil. And so I have mounded beds, which helps the drainage, right? I'm keeping them dry. I'm also covering them with plastic, which helps keeps them dry. And I'm either insulating them with mulch and or that black tarp on top of them. And so I think that's the key when you're trying to overwinter stuff. Like Brett was saying, he uses stuff on a south facing, his cannas come back, but they're south facing. So he's keeping them warm. You mulch that area or it probably has really good drainage. So you're keeping them dry, you're keeping them warm. And I think that's the secret.
When they call in and some of these things they've overwintered, I'm like, huh. And then I start to talk to them more. It's like Brett said, he's recognized that it's next to his foundation. It's probably getting some radiant effect heat from that foundation, at which, 3 degrees of protection is incredible for plants. It may not seem like a lot, but 3 degrees of temperature differential is a huge deal to plants. And I've seen people and it's always next to the foundation of homes. It seems like where they've got these beautiful mums or, elephant ears or whatever, and that they've had them there. And I'm like, how long have they been there? I don't know, 20 years plus. And I'm like, oh, but it seems like it's always next to the foundation of homes, Brett, that they have got these really cool examples of longstanding plants that they overwinter through Kentucky.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely has an effect and so just to clarify real quick, you're talking about with those dahlias with the silage tarp. You're saying that you're not digging them; you're just covering it with a silage tarp instead as an alternative to digging them.
Right. So I will dig a select few for just in case, so I don't lose. You never know, something bad could happen, and that's the truth any time of the year, really. So I'll dig a few of each variety as a safety net. Or ones that maybe are really expensive that I want to expand. The off part about not digging, whether it's dahlias or glads or whatever it is that you can't make more. So the beauty of digging those underground structures is usually you can divide those and one plant can become 5. So I do lose out on that, but also digging is the worst when you're digging, several hundred of something. And so, I leave them in the ground and I hope for the best. And on days when it's like continuously cold and cloudy, I panic. And so if you don't want to panic all winter long, actually you will still panic if you're storing them because you're going to check them and panic about them there, but it's a different style of panic.
So just in case anybody's listening and they're maybe a little confused or this is new to them, this is different from like things where there's an opportunity in the year where you can divide them, like iris, for instance. This is something where, you are propagating it, you are digging it up and dividing it. But in Irish, you could just leave it in the ground and it'll be fine, right?
Yeah.
This is a situation where it's like you may be digging it up or doing something else just because it needs to stay warm. And so I think for me, that mapping of what things fall into they can stay in the ground all year, all winter,
Super
doesn't
hardy
matter,
or
nobody
not.
cares, and then the stuff that falls into this category. But I mean, I'm thinking, and as I'm hearing you talk about dahlias, I'm hearing you talk about this. We haven't really done much discussion of propagation, even a deep dive on dahlias. What time of year are we typically doing that type of thing? The digging them up and dividing them and all that.
Yeah, the digging up of most stuff is going to happen actually post frost. It can happen pre-frost, but for the most part, any time right around frost, right before or right after.
And there's a reason for that, right? That timing, there's a really good reason botanically for that.
Yeah. So the reason why most of the literature will tell you to do it after frost, the research will tell you, is because it will kill the above ground growth, but remember, the soil is much warmer, and that's where the bulb or whatever it is, is located. So it's going to stay alive. It's going to kill the above ground growth, and then that will actually send hormones, certain chemicals down to that root system that says, okay, it's time for us to go to sleep. And so those tubers and bulbs will start thickening up, so that physically the skin will start to thicken, and it'll shut down in ways that enable you to store it and for it to go long time without growing. So it is really cool. But I'm saying the literature says that, but the farm
in a year like this is tough. In a year like this where things didn't get
way
killed
too
was
long.
very tough.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the farmer experience will tell you, and this is where the beauty of having both of those.
Your farmer experience may vary.
Is talk to those old farmers. We've said this before. Go to the conference, talk to the farmers, talk to the people who have done it, get their vibe, and then cross-reference it with kind of what the research, quote unquote, says, which is the research is never as up to date as you wish it was. So you can dig a lot of that stuff early, and you do that by basically becoming the frost. So you cut off all the foliage, and you kind of force it to do that, and you'll leave it in the ground for a couple weeks to allow that thickening process to happen, and then you can dig them.
You mentioned a process, and we probably should talk our way through this process, because in general, there is kind of a prescription or a process that you go through if you're not familiar with doing this. We've just talked about the end game, which is at the end of the season, either dies naturally or you terminate the top portion, leave it in the ground for a while. And the next step would be, I hear people refer to the next step as sort of a curing phase, a week or two, is when I see people spreading these things out. Is that what you do as well? You kind of spread things out, and what's the purpose of that? Air drying or what?
I think it really depends on what it is. I mean, Brett, you've got more. You've grown like sweet potatoes and stuff, haven't you? In your past,
yeah.
Like I've never grown sweet potatoes, but I know they're a good example of something that like has to be like cured. Because in the flower world, we don't necessarily have to cure. We let them cure underground. For the most part.
I see people doing that mainly for drying purposes, but also when I see growers that have a lot of things, they actually sort through and look for defects, I guess, at that time too. And this is, they go through this process, they kind of spread things out. And then that's when they basically start thinking about more of that in storage that you've already started talking about, Alexis, at 40 to 60 degrees, depending on what you have. There's
and that could be like a whole episode. Like if you all
because
you as listeners are interested in storage of,
there's all different tactics. Like I've seen so many different growers store them different ways throughout their season, like during that time.
Yeah, like garlic versus sweet potato versus onions versus dahlias is all going to be
we make it sound easy when we say keep it at just the right moisture. Are you storing it with or without peat moss, or with or without wood chips? Or there's a lot of different ways to store things. But the toughest thing I find, once whatever process you went through of cleaning or not cleaning the plants, knocking off dirt, however you get to the storage point. But the tough thing for me is there's this whole thing you've got to monitor things, especially if you have a large quantity, however you've stored them, with or without some kind of medium. Is you constantly have to monitor the moisture, because you don't want them to get too dry and desiccate, but you don't want them to be wet and rot. And it's like a constant monitoring. If you have a big quantity, even small quantities, you're monitoring these things every now and again just to kind of check on them. And getting that moisture just right is, to me, probably the toughest thing.
I think the moisture is, like I said, whether you're in field with stuff or you're storing it. To me, moisture, if you can control that, the cold is a little bit more manageable.
Oh,
right?
sure.
Like,
yeah, it is.
Outside, but there's, it's a whole thing. Okay, I've written it down. We're gonna have to do a whole episode on storage, but I want to kind
of there's a lot of different ways to do
that.
Well,
even just something you mentioned, the sweet potatoes. So I remember reading about this a couple years ago, just because I was curious. So sweet potatoes are cured hot and humid.
Yeah, it's wild.
It's like they'll have
the time of year.
It's the way where they generate or came from. Yeah,
it's like, it's like 80 degrees or plus, and like 90+% humidity, and so like these curing facilities where they do this for storage, caliber potatoes, are like these big hot like warehouses where everything's spread out. And even just like the idea that there are like fresh onions and storage onions, and that's like a whole part of the marketing. Like
new potatoes.
You go to the grocery store and it's like, oh, I just want a bag of onions. Well, sometimes they've been cured, sometimes they haven't been. And in most cases, I think in Kentucky, at least in like local markets, most of the stuff that you have access to has not been cured, which just means that it hasn't been sufficiently dried and enzymatically handled to make it last a really long time.
Yeah, like if you've ever have an amaryllis bulb and you forget and put an apple anywhere near that in the fridge, or storing something and then it rots immediately, and you're like, oh, you've learned a valuable lesson that storage is not always easy. Storage is not easy in some cases. And like you said, Brett, I mean, there's a whole science behind that, and you could do a whole episode just on specific humidity ranges, temperature ranges, and obviously the bigger the operation, the more you have to pay attention to those things. But it's fascinating to me, all the different ways you can accomplish these things.
Yeah. And so I want to jump back, because I think that can be a lot for people, and a lot of people aren't going to dig, or they just want to replace stuff every year, which is totally fine. I know dahlia growers who don't dig because it was economically not better for them to dig and spend the labor hours to dig
the
and
labor
then
that goes
store
into it.
Versus and dahlias are expensive. Like a cheap dahlia tuber that produces one tuber, one plant the first year is like a minimum of $5. Like, buy it in bulk. So you're looking at big prices, but for some people economically it made the most sense, which is a whole other fascinating conversation for me. But jumping kind of back out to if you've got stuff outside, like things that you can do for whether you're a homeowner or going larger scale, or you're growing things in pots, like whether they be like Brett and they're like bonsais,
a whole different thing,
or like Brett and I were talking about this morning,
tough.
and there's just like there's so many different levels based on what that plant's kind of hardiness is, and if
then when you stick it in a pot, that changes, right?
Yeah,
like completely. Right. If you stick it, and I'm sure you're really in tune with that, Brett. But we've did a lot of discussion. Well, why did this die? It was a hardy plant. It was like, where did you have it? And they had said, well, we had it in a big container outside. I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah, generally speaking, in the same way that the foundation wall of your house has this moderating effect, and this kind of it's a heat sink, it can store heat and bank heat, and it just moderates the temperature. The soil system, in addition to its water column effects of pulling water and all the other fun, interesting stuff with that, it acts as this giant thermal sink. And so a tree in the ground is sort of or a plant in the ground is sort of the norm, or it's like that's where it's expecting to be. And what you're doing is you're pulling it up out of that environment, and you're taking a theoretically, massive heat sink of the soil as far as its roots can stretch, and you're converting it into, even a large pot, you're converting it into a much smaller environment. And so I think in general, if you have a tree in a pot, it will be if you have a plant in a pot, you can tell I think about trees mostly, but if you have a plant in a pot, it's going to be less cold hardy than it would be in the ground. Full
I'd
stop.
say by at least like zone absolutely. Too. So if like the plant says it's hardy to zone 6, then it's probably in a pot might only be hardy to zone 7, unless it's like specifically pot grown, like meant for a pot type of situation.
If you think about that soil column, I mean, we think about, the ground's frozen hard solid, but really how many inches down does the ground freeze? And then it's unfrozen under that. A tree or a plant that grows out in a natural soil column, there's only a certain portion, a thin portion of that soil line that actually freezes. But in a pot, it freezes through and through and through. Mm-hmm. Not only that, but if you've got something like an Alberta spruce or an evergreen or something that we see those a lot in pots, is that, that pot, which is probably full of some artificial medium that's appropriate for growth in a pot, it dries out incredibly. So you have a very dry environment, a very cold, frozen environment. And all of these things are working against you, especially with things like evergreens that lose a lot of, moisture in the wintertime with drying winds. So there's a lot of things working against you. And I love that, what you just said. And I've heard it referred to that way before with other folks that work with these things, is that you lose a couple of numbers on that hardiness scale. If we're in zone 7, it's more like hardiness to zone 9. If you stick in a pot, all of a sudden you're losing 1 to 2 zones.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a cool way of putting that.
And I think generally speaking, within, the bigger the pot, the smaller the pot, the more you lose, or the more that things swing. It's just like, trying to imagine heating a pot of water has a couple of cups of water in it versus a big gumbo pot that has several gallons. It takes a lot longer time to heat and cool that larger amount. And so the swings and the ground is the largest pot of all.
Many years ago, we worked with I don't know if you guys heard of pot and pot nursery container production.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
But that's above ground. But we actually worked with a system on reclaimed strip mines. I don't know, it was many years ago. But it was actually, we sunk containers, we lined them with copper to manage root development and escape. But we put the liner pot in the ground, and it made such a huge difference for survivability of nursery crops. It was almost to the point to where it was the same as in-ground native planted nursery stock. And that was the pot and pot system, but buried in the ground. And it made that big of a difference. And there's some other benefits too. It's very labor intensive. So it's not widely used today, to my knowledge. So some nurseries use it, but that was so cool. And it really just enforced the fact that there's a lot of benefits of having that insulative effect of having the plant in the ground. But as like bonsai growers, Brett, does anybody kind of manage like bonsai or plants by actually sinking them in the ground or healing them in the wintertime? How's that dealt with?
There's definitely a healing in practice that a lot of people do. And stop me if you've heard this one before. It's recommended, this is, I need to put a caveat on this, that I've told Alexis has heard me say this before, but there's someone along the way referred to a rickety bridge between the world of horticultural science and bonsai. And so there's
broken slats.
There's a connection, but there's some things about it that so as I talk about this, I'm talking about common practices in the world of bonsai. As there's not a lot of research as far as extension research based information like we put out about it, because it's not commercially all that viable in the United States. It's not a big industry. In Japan it is, but in the United States it's not. But anyway, so one typical way of doing it is a healing in. So it's like HEEL. So you're like, I don't know why they exactly call it that, but you're kind of pushing soil or mulch or some sort of insulative thing up around the base, and even maybe covering it so that it looks like a little tiny tree planted in the ground. Typically you would do that on a south facing site of some sort, so that it has access to the sun, so the sun can kind of warm it. Some people will just pull them into unheated greenhouses so that it keeps the temperature between 30 and 40, the whole time. Some people but this isn't to that point of like the earth and the effect that it has.
This is cool.
So so like in the world of bonsai, a typical way of displaying the tree is to have it on a bench, and it's like, oh, you put it there because it looks nice. That's true. but it's also the opposite of what we were just talking about, where the ground has this thermal mass. It actually helps the tree grow better, be stronger, etc. When you put it on the bench, it actually slows it down even more, because that's what most of bonsai is about slowing the tree so it doesn't grow. So, for instance, what I do is when the temperature hits 28 degrees, the only real intervention that I have to take is to just take the tree off the bench and just sit it on the ground.
Oh, cool.
And that makes a huge amount of difference. Just that contact with the
no
earth.
Covering or anything, just
no covering or anything at
That's
that
awesome.
point.
Yeah.
And then and there's some really high level people who do that way. And then, as it moves down and down into the teens, I do more like covering and that sort of thing. But it is amazing in a world of technology and all this crazy stuff, just like being on or in the ground is like a solution to a lot of these
absolute
problems.
game changer. That I didn't realize that you could just sit like them on the ground. That is pretty cool. Like you're not even heeling them in, like you just discussed. And
that's really neat.
Yeah, that's really cool. I guess so. That's the two ways of that I deal with pots is either you can sink the pot in the ground, even as a homeowner, with a single pot of something that's going to help a lot, or you can group them together. If you're like a nursery, a lot of times when you heel in plants, you heel them in groups.
Yeah, definitely.
And you kind of bring them together, and then you cover them with some kind of substrate, mulch or something. You usually potting soil, peat moss, or
So
whatever.
I'm sorry. I was going to say, let me ask you this, Ray, or who the squad. So let's say I've got a Alberta spruce in a pot that I got from Home Depot, and it was on sale as a Christmas tree, and I kept it for a couple of years. Why don't I just bring it in and keep it in my living room all winter?
Tough one.
The humidity.
It's not going to like that dry air.
Yeah.
It will drop all of its needles. Ask me how I know.
It is. The more needles it's going to drop. And who was telling me that? Was it about figs, that if you do that with a plant, that it's critical for like a couple of weeks, or very important for a couple of weeks? With an evergreen, they've already said it. The humidity is going to just really be tough on that. But they were saying that if you bring in a plant like a fig, if it's one of those things you can bring in and out, to put it in the shade for a couple of weeks to get it used to the different environment. Is that, have you guys done anything like that? I have not.
I overwinter citrus. I have a lemon tree. And
lemon tree.
Yeah, I just kind of like slowly acclimated in.
That's right. They drop their leaves like a bunch if you just move them from outside the inside.
And then, I'm lucky that I have like really large windows. I get a lot of bright and direct light, and they'll get pretty content and happy in that spot. But then they can definitely tell a difference if I have to move it around and it's not getting that bright light. It starts to drop its leaves.
So do you kind of transition that by like doing the shade transition thing?
I leave it out pretty long for like cooler nights, because citrus certain types can withstand way cooler temperatures than I think. Like most people
I looked it up the other day because I was stressed.
They can go to almost freezing, right?
Well, a Meyer lemon can go down to like 28 for a couple hours, like just a couple hours. But I was shocked at that.
So I kind of like leave mine out a little bit to make it a little hardier, I guess, in a way, like let it have that fluctuation. And then just like the natural, I also feel like how we talked about in our holiday plant kind of thing, the natural daylight changing.
Oh yeah.
And it's getting acclimated that way until I absolutely have to bring it in, right?
How old is it? Is it, you said it's a few years old, your lemon tree?
This one is just a year old. I had a really large one, and it was a big tree with no roots.
Oh,
basically. And like we got it to survive almost through the winter, and then I took it out in the spring to repot it. And when I pulled it out of that pot, I was like, there are no roots on this thing.
Oh gosh.
And so like I tried to prune it back and make the ratio work well, but it just did not. So I would suggest starting off with some of the smaller ones. They're easy.
I always forget about citrus, and that's so cool. And I've never grown those myself much, but that's such a cool thing that you can move in and out. Are there smaller citrus plants? It's just showing my lack of knowledge in the area, but is there like dwarfing varieties that you can move in and out like more easily?
Different, like Alexis mentioned, the Meyer lemons, I think, are the easiest ones to take care of. There's different limes that you can get. There's different, I've not done any of the oranges. There's like one variety of orange, but I know it's like not that tasty to eat, right? Like whatever variety that is.
Like we would get from our more
say even the non quote unquote dwarf varieties, because they're not always easy to find. So if you do find one, Don't be scared of it, because most it will be so slow in the pot, and the fact that you're bringing it inside that you're probably never going to have an issue with it being too large unless you were growing it in like a greenhouse environment, which mine came from someone with a greenhouse, and it is literally in a huge stock tank. And
hers is a tree.
I have to put it on a cart that I have to, like, 2 people have to pull. So that's a little bit of a different, but if you're just like someone who wants to keep it as a, like, quote unquote house plants, and you get an occasional lemon around Christmas, which is always super fun.
And the flowers smell amazing.
The flowers smell amazing. You can put it anywhere. So yeah, I think just kind of, I just wanted to talk about this. Thank you all for indulging me on it, because it was something that I was dealing with, like, personally, and just kind of sending out reminders that even if it has been really cold and you're like, oh no, maybe I killed this. If it's something that's semi-hardy here, it's the kind of the start of winter, it might have died back above ground, but you can probably still, like, dig it, especially if it's like a root or a bulb or corm or a tuber, dahlias, stuff like that. A lot of the time, if they've not gotten too wet, they're still viable. You can bring those in if you want. But even something like, your rosemary that maybe is not in a good spot and it's getting a lot of wind pressure, can be dug, or if it's in a pot, even just moving it into the garage. If it's dormant, like a fig, for example, wants to go dormant, lose its leaves. If it's in a pot, which I think is a great idea, you can just put it in the, like, garage. It doesn't have to have light because it's not photosynthesizing.
So that's glad you mentioned that. Yeah. Because a call that I get a lot, and it's really popular right now, are blueberries in pots, because they're selling like the container, like, I don't know. Which is a great idea,
actually, it's great for blueberries.
But I've actually had like a few people message me this fall about, like, oh, I saw these blueberry plants that were at like Lowe's or Home Depot that they're selling them that are meant for containers, and now I have them, and what do I do with them in the fall, because I'm afraid about them freezing. And luckily most of the people, I'm like, oh, you can put them in your garage, right?
Or shed, or
just make sure they have some water, don't overwater, and check them to be ready to move them out.
Yeah. And I think something I would add, when I was asking about why not just bring the spruce inside, with some of these trees that they're not only cold hardy, they're like expecting cold. And so if you bring it into an environment that's 60, 70 degrees, it actually doesn't have enough chilling cold days to complete its normal annual cycle, which is why some trees, like the hardiness zones, work both ways.
Yes.
Try to take something that's really warm, that needs warm, and is very sensitive to cold, and move it up north. It won't do well. But there's also spruces and other kinds of really super cold hardies. The larches, for instance, we're kind of on a tipping point of where they don't really like it anymore, because it doesn't stay cold for long enough, and it gets way too hot.
Yeah.
And so like that's another aspect of it too, where it's, I actually have somebody who's just gotten into bonsai, and we were talking about, and I was like, I mean, you could bring it in for like a couple of days, but I would not leave a juniper, for instance, inside your house. That's why, like, the heated greenhouse kind of environment, or the garage, or things like that, is a very common. But the cold, they do need some cold.
A better option there, Brett, would be, do you think, either to heal that in or sink it in the ground? Like, if you're worried about it freezing, I mean, that's a great point. I mean, but you have to address that. If you see negative 20-degree temps coming, you've got a moderate sized pot. I guess what could you do?
If it was minus 20, I would be, I don't know. I'd be very nervous. Yeah. If it was
all bets are off.
In the teens, in the teens is when I start to, like, take some intervention. And so for me, I take, and I have a bunch of trees, and I put them into these little, like, no, they're not little. I don't know why I said that. They're like these tray kind of made out of 2x4s. They're about 3 feet by 5 feet with a grate on the bottom. And so they're just trays that I can carry a bunch with another person. I can carry a bunch of plants at once. So I pull those up onto my patio underneath overhang, and then cover them with a tarp or some sort of other thing. And the heat, the effect of the ground plus the trapping of the heat is enough in those, for me, in those kinds of.
And the tarp, you're like making sure it's in contact with the ground, gets all the radiant heat. Gotcha.
Literally every time that I do that, I hear Alexis's voice in my head saying like,
same.
If it's not in you'll see a tree and it'll just be like a ghost.
Don't make
the
it a
shoots are
lollipop.
hanging over it and it's not touching the ground. And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna make it touch the ground, even though it's a pain to do that.
Yes. Yeah.
So yeah.
Y'all will have to remind me in the spring to let you know my in-laws have planted an olive tree in their backyard. So it's kind of up near the house. I saw it the other night while there was snow on the ground, and I said, "Oh, is that an olive tree right there?"
Did you know it was an olive tree?
It's a real olive.
And so they were saying, "Oh yeah, we're gonna try to put a lot of like compost and stuff around it and see what happens." So I was like, "All right." So
I've seen people do
right
that
next
with
to the
figs.
house, and
yeah,
we'll see.
Experimentation,
like a mulch snowman almost around
I've
it.
seen straw bales. Have you guys ever observed, like I'd be on farms and here's this stack of straw bales in a place that makes no sense, and like it'd be a fig right in the middle of it.
Yeah,
and like it's amazing. They've done all this elaborate hours worth of work, like building a structure in place around the fig.
I have only seen one time olive trees that were
I've never seen them
in containers and like overwintered and only moved in to a greenhouse if like absolutely needed. It was a restaurant owner in Louisville. We got to visit his farm in a previous job where he had like 12-foot high or higher fences around the property to keep deer out.
Oh wow.
And he was growing olives and he was like wrapping those containers and doing all these steps, but they were decent sized trees. I had never He's grown them here in Kentucky. He was like in Shelby County.
He's found the formula.
Yeah. Alexis, were you going to say something about experimentation? Because if you weren't, then I would.
Yeah, no, I was going to say
experimentation.
Definitely experiment, and a good place to start when you're thinking about experimenting is looking at the native range of the plant. And so, like Brett was saying, like some plants need the cold, some plants don't. So if it's native to Mexico or if it's native to Canada, you might try and think about how do we
mimic the natural range,
right? But like I think it's really, really easy to experiment with things that are on one side or the other of your zone. So if you're zone 6, then experimenting with 7 and 5, maybe even into the other ones, if you can give it a little extra protection. But experiment a little bit and see stuff. If you get a plant on sale, extra good, because if you kill it, you're not out that much. So or take more than one. My thing is like always take more than one cutting, and so that you can experiment with some, and then others you can do by the book and you see what works. And so start more seeds, take more cuttings, all those kinds of things, and you'll never know what you might figure out on the way that will help you with
pun intended. Figure out, like I hope that was intentional.
Figure out.
I think for me, this type of stuff, this propagation, just thinking about those types of things in extension, we're limited or empowered, I don't know which one, by the fact that we kind of have to base what we're talking about on some sort of factual basis. And what that ends up doing is it makes what you say relatively conservative with regard to like, planting dates, for instance. I remember when we came out with the planting date calendar, we said we don't want to come out with it because there's all kinds of microclimates, everything's variable. It's hard to really pin down exactly when you can plant tomatoes. And so what we're going to say is it's probably safe to plant tomatoes at this date. And nevertheless, people wanted it. People wanted it on our CCD site. We have these planting date calendars now. And it was not 2 weeks after we came out with them, the comments started coming in. Well, I can plant my tomatoes way earlier than this.
Good for you.
I was like, oh yeah. This is a starting point.
No, but like really good for you.
But and that's where one of those where like I really, if you're able to experiment, and I personally do experiment, and there's a lot in the bonsai. I mentioned the rickety bridge that allows a lot of bonsai people to just do wild stuff, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Well, the more risk you're willing to take, the more you can experiment. But I think that's the key is you have to know the more you go to the fringe, the more risk the more you get away from the law of averages.
No risk, no reward.
Big risk, big reward.
But there's a reason why, like in some aspects of what, like the types of fields that we work in, growers are the ones who are leading on the cutting edge of trying new things, because they're able to whatever, gonna like go for, okay, I'm gonna try something different, see if it works. And so that's a really cool part of the culture of horticulture in this regard, is the because at some point we didn't know a lot of the things that we quote unquote know now, and people experimented and did weird stuff, and here we are.
Yeah.
Not until we do it and that we know. And I have a bit of a confessional right now and a question. Do any of you guys need banana plants? Because I was told that they were not supposed to be hardy. So what did I do? I got a baby banana plant 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago. And I was like, what could it hurt? I'm going to put it next to the foundation right on the corner of my fence. Well, I have a banana grove now with the largest banana plants being about 8 inches through. They're massive.
Wow.
They are
When do they
huge, and
produce
they're probably
bananas?
10 to 12 feet tall. What's that?
Do they ever produce? Will they ever?
No,
produce
I mean, they don't overwinter. The tops don't, but they have gotten massive. They're in that perfect little microclimate, and I keep waiting for the winter to kill them because now they're a pain. They're lifting one end of my fence, and they're growing. And now that they're producing their own microclimate, kind of like the blob. It's starting to take over. But it's one of those plants I thought I was fairly safe in planting because the weather would normally thin it out, but it's at the foundation.
Yeah, it's like a 3-year perennial.
Yeah,
every
now
3
it's going
years
on
it's
a
going to get
4-year
knocked back.
perennial, and I'm nervous because I've given to everybody I know, and now there's 50 of them growing in a small grove.
Trying to
and
invite
I've got
others
issues.
into your problem situation.
Yeah, this is a problem. I was too successful because of
Look
that
at you.
microclimate. But no, it's not a good thing in this case because I only wanted one, and now there's 50 there in a small grove, and it's an issue. It is an issue. So banana plants, be careful. Don't plant them unless you love them, because they may be hardier than you think, friends. Maybe hardier than you think. Just one of those case scenarios.
Story.
Yeah. So if any of you guys want banana plants, I've got plenty and they're large. So just let me know. I'll hook you up.
I do think we uncovered a lot of potential future topics in this discussion.
Yeah, for real.
Propagation is one of them that we have not talked about at all.
Propagation,
and I would love to talk more about that.
Yeah, that's a really good one.
I think it's like the most magical part of horticulture.
This brings me so much joy.
It's so fun.
You thought I was excited today, man. Don't get me started about propagation.
So
I'm like, let's
we'll
go.
put that one off.
Yeah, you need to save that for a day I'm not going to be here if you want to be able to talk at all.
Save it for a day where you've not had caffeine. Maybe.
But I think we could do probably a whole dahlia episode at some point.
Yeah.
Or even multiple like following the crop throughout the year dahlia or something like that.
Yeah, we should. Cool. There's some really great dahlia growers in Kentucky. So and like on the borders, it's Kentucky as well. So we'd love to get them.
Could be fun
to give their knowledge, because I still constantly am learning about dahlias, and I'm hoping that the next time we talk about dahlias, I could be like, mine made it through the winter, because I am risking and hoping for reward here, people. So
there you go. Experimentation and the grower and the winter mindset. The grower comes through here and does a little experimentation. But yeah, I mean, I just, I'm not going to do the outro because that's Alexis's thing. And she really, last time she wouldn't let me in
afterwards.
In the office.
And if you listen to Ray and I in the last episodes, we were
lost.
We did a great job.
Like, how do we end this awkwardly?
Instagram, listen
all
to
of
us.
mine are awkward, and I ramble.
Fun.
So
please come back.
Yeah, I was like, this is my voice. This is not.
It's harder than you would think, right? I don't know why it becomes difficult.
I am not Alexis. This is Ray.
Did. I ended with that. This is not Alexis. Have a great day. That's how I ended it.
This is not a drill.
This is leave
not Alexis.
Comments that are nice and like us, please.
Yes.
Tell us
if something came up in the course of this episode that you would like to hear us talk more about, this is definitely something I think Alexis in particular, but the rest of us too, have some knowledge about, and certainly some enthusiasm about. So this was fun.
Yeah, you can leave us a review and tell us that you want to hear more about XYZ. Or you can shoot us an email, which is also in the show notes, and we all see those emails. And so one of us will get back to you after we've conferred, or whoever's most excited about your question will often get back to you. So we do answer those if you've got them. So feel free to reach out there. You can also find us on Instagram at HortCulturePod, and you can follow us and see cool stuff. We'll link all of these cool guests we have coming on there, and if you can shoot us a message as well, if that is an easier way for you to do so, we understand. But we hope that you keep listening. We hope that as we grow this podcast, you grow with us. Join us next time. See ya.